Good morning. We're reading from Luke 22. Jesus predicts Peter's denial. Simon, Simon, listen. Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus said to him, I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied me 3 times. And reading from John 18, verses 15 to 27, Annas questions Jesus, and then Peter denies knowing Jesus. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the police standing by struck Jesus on the face, saying, Is this how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon was standing and warming himself. They asked him, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment the cock crowed. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, and once more we're going to continue on our journey through the Gospel of John. We're up to John chapter 18, which we just had read out to us just previously, and the story of the denial of Jesus by the Apostle Peter. Now, this is a really interesting story because it's not something that just came out of the blue. It might seem like that in the story, but there is a backstory to the denial of Jesus by Peter. Whenever there is a car accident or an industrial accident, there needs to be an investigation to see what actually caused it, because it actually turns out there's really no such thing as a complete accident. Things don't just happen out of the blue. There are reasons why things happen. And so when there are investigations done of those kinds of so-called accidents, you begin to realize that there is a backstory. There's things that lead up to the moment when it all fell apart. I remember, for instance, hearing about a dam in the United States at a place called Linton in the States, and one day, all of a sudden, it just burst, and the water flowed down the valley, and hundreds of people were injured, and many dozens were drowned, and small villages were washed away. It was a complete disaster. And it may have seemed like it was just all of a sudden because it was on a beautiful sunny day when the dam burst and the whole thing fell apart. But there is a backstory. And when the investigators went out to look at what had happened, what they discovered was it wasn't just that the dam had burst, but there was a failure in the administration of the dam. What they discovered was there was misallocation of funds, there was a denial kind of culture in the management, there was a failure of political leadership, there was bad budgeting, and all these things meant that the problems that were beginning to appear in the dam were not looked into. Everyone just thought it'll be all right, and then one day the dam burst and the whole thing flowed down the valley. And there's something like that is true of this apparently sudden denial of Jesus by Peter. There is a backstory, and if we investigate it, we'll discover there's a whole lead up to this story. And if we begin to truly understand the lead up, then we'll understand why it was that Peter found himself in a position where he denied Jesus 3 times. So in the Gospel of John, we really just have a report of the facts. It's almost like, well, there's the dam bursting. That's it. That's all there is to this story. But if we poke around in some of the other Gospels and we look at some of the other parts of the story leading up to the denial of Jesus by Peter, we begin to be able to pull together all the threads and begin to understand why it is that Peter found himself in that place of denial. So, putting aside the Gospel of John, and looking at some of the other passages, for instance, we have Luke 22, where Jesus had said to Simon, "Listen to me, Satan has demanded the right to test each one of you as a farmer when he separates wheat from the husks or wheat from the chaff." And what's interesting in this story is that Peter seems to almost be saying to Jesus when he is warned about that, Peter says, "Bring it on. I'm willing to be tested. I'm willing to be tried to see how much of me is wheat and how much is chaff, because I think you'll discover that when that test is done, I am Captain Wheat. I am wheat from outside to the inside. I am wheat all the way to the core. You won't find any chaff here." That's pretty much what Peter says in regard to this test. And he even goes on to say, I'm ready to go to jail with you. I'm ready to die with you. You can trust in me. That's what Peter is saying. In another one of the passages in Matthew 26, from verse 30 onwards, it says that after they had been eating at the Last Supper, and they'd gone to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus warned them, again, like we talked about a few weeks ago, that he would be struck down, the shepherd would be struck, and that the sheep of the flock would be scattered. And then in verse 32, he says, "But after I am raised up, I will go before you into Galilee." And notice what Peter says in this context. He says to Jesus, "If all the others should be put aside, I will never fall back. I will never let you down." And then in verse 34, Jesus says to him famously, "Truly I tell you that before the cock crows, you shall deny me 3 times. And Peter said back in reply to Jesus, "Even if I must die with you, I will never deny you." And so said all the other disciples. So there's a sort of a fuller context of what's going on there. Interestingly, we need to understand this word falling away. That we've translated that in English in 3 words, or 2 words, fall away. But in Greek, it's just 1 word. And that word is scandalizo, from which we get our English word scandalized. And it can also be translated as offended. So what Jesus was saying was, tonight, all of you disciples, you included, Peter, you're all going to fall away, you're all going to be scandalized, you're all going to be offended by me, and you're going to blame me for the outcomes. And Peter in particular, he says to him, "You will deny me 3 times. Of course, Peter says that would never happen. Not me. Maybe these other snowflakes will melt away when the sun comes up, but not me. I will go with you all the way to death, all the way through suffering, no matter what it takes. You can trust in me." And so I think it's really important for us to understand, however, that the word fall away can also mean to be scandalized or to be offended. So when we look up the word scandalize in the dictionary, what we discover is it means something like shocked or horrified by the breaking of convention or expectation. And I believe that's really goes to the heart of what's going on here is Jesus is saying to Peter and the disciples, he says, tonight you're going to be shocked, you're going to be horrified because I am going to break your expectations and I'm going to break the conventions of what you believe is going on here. So if we can discover what the disciples believed was happening and what they thought Jesus was about, particularly in Peter's case, then I believe we'll begin to unlock the reasons for the failure of Peter in such a spectacular way. So how is it that Jesus broke the expectations and the conventions that the disciples had about Jesus? Well, if we look at the build-up to this whole situation, the week prior to the crucifixion, it's really interesting to see what actually occurred. So what I've done is I've gone back through the scriptures and I've kind of pieced together the story leading up to that final few hours before the crucifixion. And if we look to 1 week before, you will see that there is a very interesting build-up that takes place. Jesus comes from Jericho as he's coming into Jerusalem. Jesus had set his face to go back to Jerusalem. He knew what was going to take place. And he warned the disciples about it, but the disciples, I don't think, fully believed that Jesus was actually going to be handed over to the chief priests and the elders and would actually be crucified and put to death. I think they had something in their mind more like, well, Jesus is obviously the Messiah and he will go and there will be opposition, no doubt, but he will win the day. And some of us may get caught up in the conflict. Some of us may even die. But what I'm certain of is that Jesus will be crowned king and he will be seen by not only Jerusalem, but the whole world as the true Messiah of God. So I think that's really what was going on in the minds of the disciples and certainly in the mind of Peter. And we get some clues to that, say, in Matthew 16, when Jesus actually predicts that he's going to be put to death. And Peter says, no, you got it all wrong, Jesus. You need to rethink this and you need to see this as an opportunity to set up the kingdom of God in Jerusalem, if that's okay with you. So let's go back through some of the things that happened in the build-up to that final few hours before the crucifixion. All righty. Well, first of all, Jesus was on his way from Jericho, on his way into Jerusalem, and on his way there, on the side of the road, there were two blind men, and Jesus healed both of them. Spectacular, amazing miracle. Not just one man who was blind healed, but two. And that was an extraordinary sign that Jesus did on the way into Jerusalem. And then, even more spectacular than that, after he had gone through that area, he went on into Bethany and just happened to raise Lazarus from the dead is all. So healed two blind men and then raised Lazarus from the dead. These are obvious messianic signals, signs of who he truly was. Then, of course, we have Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem itself, and he is greeted as a long-lost king. People are throwing their tunics on the ground, the whole Palm Sunday thing, and they're waving palm trees. These are all messianic signs. When people are throwing their tunics on the ground, they're saying, as for me and my family, we're going to serve this person. He is our king, and we are acknowledging that he is the Messiah. So there was open acknowledgement that Jesus was the true king. This all fitted all the Old Testament scriptures about the return of the king. And we haven't got time to go into all of that right now, but what we can say is this is the third messianic sign as Jesus comes into town. And then shortly after that, in say John chapter 12, we have an account here of a voice from heaven underscoring the truth about who Jesus is. Jesus actually says in verse 28 that Jesus prayed that the Father would bring glory to himself. And then a voice from heaven says, I have already brought glory to myself and I will do it again. And when the crowd heard this voice, some of them thought it was thunder. Others thought an angel had spoken to Jesus. I mean, again, that's another pretty powerful sign to be taking place in the lead up to those last few days. Now, you see, all of those things, I imagine that Peter and the other disciples and the people who had gathered on the Palm Sunday were all saying, this is the true king. We acknowledge that he's the one who is going to deliver Israel. And it was a perfect political setup for Jesus to walk into town and take control and to overthrow Herod, to overthrow the chief priest and the corrupt elders of Israel, and then to get rid of the Romans and set up the kingdom of God as all of the disciples were expecting him to do. And it was right at that point that everything just went horribly sideways, not only for Peter, but for all of the disciples. And so in that moment, Jesus broke their conventions, broke their expectations, and he offended them. He scandalized them. He caused them to have a sense of disillusionment in the best sense of that word. They were holding a certain illusion. Jesus came and disabused them of that illusion. He took it away and he crushed their illusions to show them a whole new reality, how things needed to take place, how things would take place. And so the disciples went into lament. They went into a place of absolute scandalization. They couldn't believe that Jesus was throwing away such a wonderful opportunity to be the true Messiah. Now, what's really interesting is if we look elsewhere in the scriptures, we'll see this is not the first time this happened. There are plenty of other occasions where people were scandalized by God in different places. Say, right back in Genesis chapter 4, we have Cain who's angry at God. He's saying, why won't you accept my offering? My offering is at least as good as Abel's. Why won't you accept it? And I've talked about this before, but the reason that Cain's offering wasn't accepted was not because of what he offered, but the attitude with which he offered it. Cain was trying to trade with God. He was saying, look what I'm offering to you. Give me a blessing. You owe me a blessing. And he was trying to strong arm God through his religious observances. And of course, that's been a problem all through world history. And then we have Jacob, who was offended by God, and God wasn't doing things the way he wanted them done. And Esau, when Jacob got blessed, when Jacob didn't deserve to be blessed. We could talk about that all day. And then and Naaman. Naaman's a really interesting story in 2 Kings chapter 5. We have this great commander of the Syrian army who's got leprosy. And one of his servant girls says to him, you know, there's a healing in Israel. If you go into Israel, you'll find that the God of Israel can heal you. So Naaman goes out to with a great entourage of horses and a huge gift that he wants to give to the king of Israel in exchange for a healing from leprosy. When he gets to the king says, I can't help you, and instead sends him off to Elisha, who the prophet. And Elisha agrees to meet with Naaman and to give him the healing that he's seeking. And when Naaman turns up with his entourage. He turns up with many horses that are burdened down with the gift that he's going to give to Elisha. But Elisha doesn't even come out and meet him. He just sends one of his servants to tell him what to do. And the servant says to him, go and wash yourself seven times in the Jordan River, and you'll be completely cured. Now, you see, for Naaman, that broke his expectation, and he was scandalized by that. And in verse 11, it says that Naaman stormed off, grumbling, why wouldn't he come out and talk with me? I thought for sure he would stand in front of me and pray to the Lord his God and wave his hand over my skin or something like that. So what Naaman was expecting was some kind of a show, some kind of a magic show, some kind of religious ritual. And he came with the expectation that he would pay Elisha for it too. He had gifts that he would have been used to in Syria, going and seeing a soothsayer or prophet, and they were always prophets for hire, and you had to pay them in order to get anything from them. But Elisha wasn't seeking payment. He wasn't even seeking notoriety. He just sent his servant out to just give him the news, go and wash in the Jordan 7 times. And that was the other thing that offended Naaman. He said, why should I wash in your crummy little river? You know, we've got better rivers back in Syria. The Abana River and the Pharpar River. These rivers that flow through Damascus are at least as good as the Jordan. Why would I do that? And so for him, things weren't going the way he wanted them to go, and they were going the way that God commanded them to go, and he didn't like it. We'll have a little bit more to say about that kind of thing later on. And then, of course, there's Jonah, who didn't get from God what he expected, or Habakkuk. We could talk about people in the New Testament as well, Mary and Martha and the Pharisees, and we could add to that list many more, but that'll do for now. So that brings us back to Peter. Peter had an expectation. Peter had an expectation not only of Jesus, but he had an expectation that Jesus would do what he do because Peter was Peter. Peter was saying, you can trust in me. I'm made of the right stuff. Peter had a very high opinion of himself. In some senses, I believe, he thought, I deserve to be your right-hand man. I deserve to be leader of the pack. I deserve to be at the very center of what you're doing and to be one of your most trusted advisors. And he could say that with good reason. I mean, Peter was, by all surface accounts or by any outside observation, you'd have to say Peter was seemingly made of the right stuff. He was a natural leader. He was outgoing. He was passionate. He was committed to the mission of Jesus. He looked the part. But it turns out that what the problem was for Peter was that he was trusting in himself, and he was wanting to trade his fervor for favor and his commitment for blessing. And God will never trade, not with anyone. God will not let you strong arm him or put him in a position where he owes you something. That just cannot be done. Paul actually brings this up in Galatians chapter 5. And he says in chapter 5 and verse 11, but if I, brothers, are still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. That word offense there, incidentally, is exactly the same word that Jesus used when he said that the disciples will fall away. And what Paul is saying here is, if I was still going around preaching about keeping law in order to get the blessings of God, then no one would be offended, because that is the natural religious order. That's the way everyone expects things to be done. But when I come preaching that it's what God has done for us in Christ through the crucifixion of his Son, then that's offensive because it breaks convention and it throws all of your religious wisdom out the window and turns the whole world upside down. And so Paul said, wherever I go, I preach the gospel, and wherever the gospel is truly preached, people get offended, because what it says is you've got nothing to offer to God. It's really a matter of faith and receiving what God is giving. And this is a thread that runs right through the scriptures, from Cain all the way through to the preaching of the gospel in the New Testament, to the ministry of Paul. And Peter was one of those along the way who got caught up in all of this, and he was offended. Martin Luther, in the Heidelberg Disputation, in thesis number 22, he says this: the remedy for curing desire, that is, the lust of the flesh for self-made righteousness, which is the normal religious order, he said the remedy for curing that desire does not lie in satisfying it. In other words, it doesn't lie in that desire reaching its own goal and saying, look, God, look what I've done. I've done this amazing thing for you. Now you owe me a blessing. He says, no, that's not where it works itself out. He goes on to say that the remedy for curing desire does not lie in satisfying it, but in extinguishing it. And there's where the offense comes from. And the preaching of Christ crucified does exactly that. And this was what Jesus knew he had to do. He knew he had to go into crucifixion, and that is what Peter didn't want. Peter wanted to somehow be right there with him, suffering with him, winning the war with him, and having a share in the victory that Jesus would accomplish. But of course, Jesus had to win a victory that no one could fight for him. He had to fight that alone. He had to go to the cross on behalf of not just everyone else out there, but for Peter as well. And Peter had to be one of those who had to humble himself to receive the gift that God was giving. Brendan Manning says this. He says, the prophetic word unfailingly summons the church back to the purity of the gospel and the scandal of the cross. In his numerous letters, Paul confirms that to follow Jesus is to take the high road to Calvary. Littered along the way will lie the skeletons of our egos, the corpses of our fantasies of control, and the shards of our self-righteousness, self-indulgent spirituality, and unfreedom. And that's exactly what happened to Peter. Peter had his self-righteousness and his self-indulgent spirituality and his fantasy of control. All of those were thrown against a rock and broken by Jesus. So when the cock crowed at dawn the next morning, Peter discovered that he had done exactly what he promised he wouldn't do. He had denied Jesus those 3 times in that account in John 18. We see that when Peter was put to it, he was so thrown sideways by what was going on that he forgot himself and he denied Jesus 3 times. When the cock crowed, he suddenly came to a place where he realized, I thought I was made of the right stuff. I thought that when the test would come, I'd be shown to be all wheat and no chaff. But he'd been weighed and he'd been tested and he'd been found wanting. What he discovered was he had nothing. He was all chaff, and he wept bitterly with remorse. Now, for many people, you could look at that and say that was an absolute failure. It was a breakdown, but maybe it was a breakthrough. Sometimes, and I believe this is true for every person, we come to a place where we realize that we need to just let God do what he wants with our lives. It's not about what we do for God. It's about what he does for us. And for the flesh, that is our self-made spirituality, our instinctive spirituality, it's one of the most offensive things to realize that we cannot climb the stairway to heaven. We have to be carried there on the back of Jesus Christ and what he has done on the cross and the resurrection. But it's the only way, and it is the way. And it is, even though we get forced to that place where we have what seems like a breakdown, it can actually be a breakthrough into the true life that Jesus wants us to enter into. Amen.